Hello, I'm Sir Lacrosse, and today I'm going to comment on a recent update on the Warhammer Oldworld project they've got going at Games Workshop. There's been a little bit of an update on what's going on with that on the Warhammer community site. And back when the Warhammer Oldworld announcement first came out, I think it was November 2019, I made on YouTube here a little bit of a prediction of what we might see happen with that, because they weren't exactly too explicit back then. All they said it was going to be like the Horus Heresy for fantasy, and there'd be square bases and things like this, but they didn't really say that much about what was going to happen. And there hasn't been huge amounts of updates since that time. I think there's been one other which I missed, and then there's this one today, which I've just seen. And so anyway, I made some predictions back in November of 2019 about what we might see, how this project might surprise us. So I'm just going to just see how close I got, because this update sort of answered some of the speculations I had. So the first speculation was that the Warhammer Oldworld would be different from Warhammer Fantasy Battles in that it would open up new territory. We'd see more. It would go into other parts of the world that we hadn't seen before very much of. And I did speculate that it would be the Darklands that would get the treatment, which is just to the east of the sort of typical like Europe-esque part of the old world, which was the Empire Bretonia in that. And that's where I think most of the action takes place there in Warhammer Fantasy Battles, the first 8 editions. Of course, there was Lustria as well. There was a supplement on Lustria. Then you got a few battles and whatnot going on there. But mostly, everything in the lore was happening there in the Empire and around it, But this one, they might go more, open up some more territory. That's my guess back then I made, and it does look like from this update they've said that Kislev is bigger than we think of it. Kislev is now is a big empire at this time in this new old world, if that makes sense. It goes quite far east. It's more of a big nation as a proxy for Russia. I mean, that's what Kislev is, isn't it? It's kind of like a fancy version of Russia and Poland. And it's going to be in the Darklands, pretty much. I mean, a lot of it. I mean, that part of the world is going to be opened up, and they did mention that some of the factions that we sort of knew existed, but were never got their own armies or anything, like that hobgoblins. I think they exist out there somewhere. So there'll be hobgoblins, presumably, at some point. So I think that my prediction I made that they would, new old world, the Warhammer Oldworld, would go to the old world, but not just the parts that we know from Warhammer Fantasy Battles, but also some of these other places, and specifically the Darklands in the east. My other prediction, or not prediction, speculation, should we say, was that they wouldn't go to the same time period as Warhammer Fantasy Battles. Pretty much, I think all the editions from 3rd, or even before that possibly, the action all took place during the reign of Karl Franz of the Empire, right? And then, of course, there was the end times, which is the sort of final moments of that time. I did think back then when it was first announced, and there were not many details, except they said they hinted that it might be a bit like the Horus Heresy in some way. Well, of course, the Horus Heresy is the backstory to Warhammer 40k's current time period, which actually has moved on a bit now. That was 10,000. The Horus Heresy is set 10,000 years before the current time of Warhammer 40k. So I did think that might mean that Warhammer Oldworld would go back to the first age of Sigmar, because that to me is the equivalent to the Horus Heresy for the Warhammer Fantasy universe. This was the time period when the human hero Sigmar, becomes an emperor and unites the human tribes, and eventually he becomes a god, and then he comes back in the Age of Sigmar after the end times. So that time period was in the lore 2,500 years before the reign of Karl Franz. So it's quite a long time ago. It's kind of like it's like the sort of Jesus times compared to today for the Warhammer Fantasy world. And the announcement set today that we've had, yesterday, depending on when you see this video, if you see it, has indicated there will be in a different time. So I was kind of right, half right at least, but it's not going to be the first Age of Sigmar. It's going to be something like 200 years ago, I think it is. I looked up, because basically what they said was going to be the last big chaos incursion before the end times. And I had a look in the Warhammer Empire Army book for the 4th edition. It's just the first book I picked up that I thought might have the timelines for the old world. And my guess is it's probably it'll be set in the year 2300, which is the time of the Emperor Magnus the Pious. And apparently at that time, there was a big chaos incursion, and Kislev was threatened, and Magnus the Pious rode up to help or something. I don't know the details because I didn't really read it deeply, but that seems likely that's the time period they're picking for this new old world, right? Yeah. So I was kind of half right there. I was right that it was going to be a different time period, that they weren't just going to go back to the immediate pre-old times. They were going to pick a different period in the long history of the Warhammer Fantasy world, and but they didn't go back as far as I thought they might, based on their reference to the Horus Heresy. In fact, they've only gone 200 years back instead of 2,500. Half a point? Maybe I got half a point for getting that right. Yeah. And the final guess that I made, the final speculation, was that they wouldn't go back to the old. They would do this old world, new old world, this reboot of Warhammer Fantasy Battles on a different scale. I think there's probably an element of wishful thinking here on my part, because I do think 28mm scale is too big a scale for large practical war gaming, right? It's nice for painters, 28mm scale, because you can paint mustaches and pimples and belt buckles and stuff, and that's all fun. But the practicalities of gaming large battles on 28mm scale it's just a bit hard, really. I mean, if you look at it, right, what kind of army has just, say, 200 soldiers in it? That's not an army. That's not even a war band. It's a little bit bigger than a street gang, basically. But practically, at 28mm scale, 200 models is a lot of models, and it fills the table, and it costs a lot of money, and it takes a lot of time to paint, and it's a bit of a chore. But if it's on a smaller scale, like 10mm, like War Master was, then you can have quite substantial looking armies, but still it's not so expensive to buy, and it's not so time consuming to paint, and it's relatively easy to carry around, right? So I just think it's a more practical scale for massed army type wargaming, right? And in historical games like Napoleonic stuff and all this kind of thing, they usually don't go to this large 28mm scale that Warhammer 40k is on, and Warhammer Fantasy Battles is on. I mean, I guess is it Bolt Action's on 20mm scale, but I think Flames of War's 15mm, for example. So that's World War II, right? But it just for wargaming, it is just a better scale. The table's effectively bigger, right? because you might think 10 millimeter is just a third the height of 28 millimeter, roughly. But what that actually means is the footprint of a model is not a third, it's like a ninth, because it's the footprint is not the width, it's also the width by the length on the ground. So that works out. So if you shrink a 28 millimeter model down to 10 millimeters, then the space it takes on the table is not 1/3, it's actually a ninth. And that just makes effectively that makes your table 9 times as big in terms of your battlefield area. So there's more room for maneuver and all the sort of things that like that you expect from a war game. That's the thing with it wasn't so bad for Warhammer Fantasy Battles because people there aren't really long range weapons because it's fantasy, so it's a medieval-ish kind of thing. There's magic, which is basically equivalent to your modern sci-fi weapons in a way, but in a fantasy setting. But people are fighting mostly with swords and bows and arrows and stuff, apart from the magic and the dragons and whatnot. And so that is not real long range weapons, and because of that when you have big models filling up a table, it doesn't feel too crowded in a way. And also because it was a rank and file game, so most of the models were all quite compact. They were in regiments on quite packed together in a like a block. They're all in blocks, and that helped. That keeps the table relatively open for the number of models you might have. Whereas, for example, with Warhammer 40k, people are fighting with laser weapons, and there's artillery pieces and even supersonic jets and stuff. And I don't know if you've worked it out, but at 28 millimeter scale, a 6 foot by 4 foot table, which is a relatively big table now because they've changed it so that the table size for games is even smaller for Warhammer 40k. If you ever worked it out, at 28 millimeter scale, a 6 foot by 4 foot table is basically the equivalent to a football pitch. Now, do you think you could have a modern battle using laser guns and artillery pieces in a football pitch? Tanks, right? Supersonic jets? No. And if you ever see Warhammer 40k played with 28 millimeter models, it just looks retarded. Even on a big table, because you got these massive fucking tanks and on this teeny little football pitch sized battlefield, and it's presumably it's even worse now because the new editions they've made the tables, the sort of standard gaming areas, even smaller for the smaller point games. Whereas epic scale, Warhammer 40k had an epic scale equivalent, back in the day. In fact, now again, we got Adeptus Titanicus, so there's something of that scale is back again. It definitely is much more plausible to have these kind of modern long-range weapons and soldering stuff, war machines, tanks and the like, flying machines on that table, and it just doesn't look silly as much. So yeah, I'm going on about this a bit too much, but I just think I would have liked to seen Warhammer Oldworld on a War Master type scale. But the announcement obviously has squashed that. So that's one prediction I did get, not prediction, but speculation I did get wrong. So that was the three things. So the first one, Dark Clans, new territory, kind of got that right because Kislev is going to be bigger and it's going to go to the east. So it does look like they're going to open up the world a bit more than had been the case. with Warhammer Fantasy Battles. And Age of Six. So yeah, the time period will be different, which I'm sort of right about that. I did think it would be Age of Sigmar, but it wasn't. And finally, I did think that they might go with a change of scale. But a lot of that's wishful thinking on my part. And no, the update is confirmed that that's not going to happen. Right? It's going to be 28mm scale, just as before. So, I mean, that's probably going to make a lot of the old guard relatively happy, because I mean, obviously there was Warhammer Fantasy Battles did have a big player base before Age of Sigmar blew that up, and I'm sure Games Workshop's well aware that they annoyed a lot of people when they blew up the old world and brought in Age of Sigmar. And I'm sure Age of Sigmar is doing fine, and it's brought in new players and stuff, and in some ways it might have been an easier game to get into for newer players, because it's a skirmish game, so you don't, in theory, you don't need as many models and whatnot. So yeah, so Warhammer Fantasy Battles, yeah. So, you know, they annoyed a lot of people when they blew up the old world. They annoyed me, actually, because, I mean, although I didn't think it was ideal scale for Warhammer Fantasy Battles, when I was getting back into the hobby, I mean, after many decades, I wanted to play Warhammer Fantasy Battles, and I got in just at the last days of Warhammer of 8th edition, and then they brought in the end times, and then it was Age of Sigmar, and I spat my dummy out, to be honest, because although I hadn't invested heavily into Warhammer Fantasy Battles yet, you know, I'd bought a few of the books on eBay, and I'd started painting some models and whatnot, but I hadn't really thrown down too much compared to some people. But I just wasn't interested in Age of Sigmar. I wanted a rank and flank fantasy game, you know, square bases and all this, rank and flank, you know. And I probably would have preferred a smaller scale just for the practicalities of it, like so War Master effectively, or like it, something like it. But I could put that aside and just do Warhammer Fantasy Battles. I'd be fine with that. I'm rambling now, aren't I? Where did I get to? Okay, so I'm going to just... yeah, so the speculations I made back in the day, nearly 2 years ago, I kind of got 2 out of 3, I would say. I was wrong about the scale, but everything else is kind of on point. So, do we need new speculations? What do we really know is going to happen? Well, the update does say that... you know, they've said that Kislev is going to be a big empire at this time period, and I wonder, and if it's mainly the main story point is this earlier Chaos incursion, which was mostly, I mean, the empire helped, but it was mostly between Kislev and the Chaos peoples. So perhaps the focus human faction might be Kislev rather than the Empire as such, which would be fun, because, you know, Bretonia got a fair old selection of models, and the Empire had a lot. The Empire, this is Warhammer Fantasy Battles. Kislev, they just got a little bit. They didn't really get that much. It was a very, very low key kind of small offering of models back in the day. So I think it'd actually be pretty cool if they did a full-on Kislev faction, and it does look like that's what's going to happen. And my speculation is that we'll see if I'm right, because, you know, it's maybe a year's time we might see something actually being released. Who knows? I think the box set does look like it might be. That, you know, if there's going to be a box set, a sort of Isle of Blood type box set, which is the opening salvo, the initial purchase to get into Warhammer Oldworld when it finally happens, something like the Isle of Blood box set, or the Battle of Skull Pass for their respective old versions of Warhammer Fantasy Battles. The box set I think will be Kislev and a Chaos faction. And I know there's a lot of people who kind of were sad about the Chaos Dwarfs never got that much love since I think 4th edition. They kind of got forgotten about, set by Forge World. They didn't get army books at all since I think it's 4th edition. So and Chaos Dwarfs, I think that would work for that period, for that area. If it's going to be Kislev, east into the Darklands, and obviously north into the Chaos Wastes for the primary story arc for this new edition of Warhammer Fantasy Battles, then the Chaos Dwarfs would work as a faction, and the other I think might be Norska, because Norska's did get quite a lot of development in the video game Total War's version of Warhammer. So I think they might do that. I think that's what the box set will be. That's my speculation. So it'll be Kislev and either Chaos Dwarfs and Norska to square off. What else? Oh, yes. And if it's 200 years ago, I don't think aesthetically it should look all that different, which should please some people, because obviously the old guard sort of Warhammer Fantasy Battle players, they were upset that all their models on their square bases were, obsoleted by the Age of Sigmar thing. And so Games Workshop wants to bring these people back, and that's what this Old World project obviously is for. It's to mollify these old guard players who wanted Warhammer Fantasy Battles to keep going forever, basically. So it's not like you're going to have to go. Most of the factions would look the same. 200 years ago, they wouldn't be that much different, especially the dwarves and the elves and whatnot. They probably wouldn't look all that different. But the Empire, the human empires, might look a bit different. They could look a bit different, but not. It's 200 years, so it's not that big a gap. I mean, if they had gone back to the first Age of Sigmar, then I think it's pretty clear that the Empire would be a lot different. They wouldn't have all the fancy gunpowder weapons they have now. They would be a lot more primitive, I guess. But 200 years ago, I think even then I would expect the Empire not to have quite so much tech. I think they would be a bit less late Renaissance and a bit more like mid-medieval, perhaps, or maybe late medieval. Britannia probably wouldn't be different because they were a bit backward anyway, really. And Kislev would probably look quite the same to what we expect, to be dudes on bear riders and whatnot. And greenskins would be the same probably, But, well, there is one difference. I do think, this is another speculation. Now, I've written about this on my blog. I haven't made a video about it yet, but it does look like Games Workshop is moving away from what we call heroic scale. And if you don't know what heroic scale is, it's basically swollen heads, on your models. They look, I might put a picture up here to show you what I mean. But the heroic scale models have unusually huge or proportionally big weapons and hands and heads. They're disproportionately large. It's a kind of a warped scale. It's some people think heroic scale is like it's too big, but it's not all of the model that's too big. It's just parts of the body, especially the hands, weapons, and head, things like that. The extremities, the torsos are actually not that bad. So, and you don't really notice it so much when you just see heroic scale models next to other ones, as you do with Games Workshop, because it's more of a signature thing for Warhammer 40k and Warhammer Fantasy Battles heroic scale. It's not, you don't find it elsewhere, right? Other wargaming miniatures usually are in what we would call true scale, which is to say, for the given scale, all the parts are proportionately correct, So if your model just looks like a scaled down human, if it's a human soldier, it just looks the same proportionate. The proportions of the body are the same as they would be if it was scaled up, or if you know what I mean. Right, but heroic scale is not like that. It's all a bit wonky. And we can speculate why they did it, but it was a thing for Games Workshop for the longest time. And so, yeah, the first, I've written about this on my blog. You can find the link in the description. But yeah, so heroic scale, the first clue that it was starting to get squatted or got rid of and switched to true scale really was the Primaris, the release of Primaris for Warhammer 40k 8th edition. Because these new Marines were obviously taller than the old Marines, but that's not the really profound difference. The profound difference is the fact that they are true scale. Their hands are not, are not proportionately are more proportionate to their body and their heads and I'll put a picture up here because I did write about it on a blog post, and you can, if you're interested, you can read that if you like. Actually, I've been grumbling about heroic scale versus true scale a few times, and I've done a couple of videos comparing true scale Perry mercenaries and the GW heroic scale handgunners kit. I compared them, and you can see the differences between heroic scale and true scale in that video, and I'll put a link here if you want to watch that. In fact, I think I did 2 videos about it because I was kind of a bugbear. But anyway, so hopefully there have been other releases since the Primaris which have been in true scale as well, or something close to it. So there was a Soul Blight Gravelords, and now this Dominion box set has got the Cruel Boys, and the Cruel Boys in it definitely look like, well, they're orcs, but they're not like the old orcs used to be. They're definitely more true scale than heroic scale. Their heads are not gigantic, and their hands are not gigantic. They're quite, again, I'll put a picture up here. But you can read all about it in my blog post, but I don't really want to talk about this too much here because it's not about Warhammer Oldworld so much as to say that my speculation is that Warhammer Oldworld will try to go, will continue with this true scale way of doing things, right? So yeah, this is my new speculation that the Warhammer Oldworld will be in true scale. The new releases for it will be in true scale. I expect they will re-release. There's a good chance they'll re-release some of the old plastics that they didn't. You know what I mean? I think the Empire Knights kit, you can't get that anymore. I mean, some of them are still available, but the Bretonnians have gone, and the Tomb Kings have gone. You can't buy them anymore on the except secondhand, obviously, on eBay. And even some other kits that were sort of staples, like the Empire Knights kit for the Empire faction. You can't get that anymore, except not new anyway. And you could pay crazy prices on eBay if you want the original kits. So I don't know. I mean, maybe they could get re-released as is. I mean, that would be the kind of the cheap option for them because they've still got the molds, and their plastics, the steel molds, they last forever basically, I think. So they could keep really redoing them forever. But then again, if they could get refreshed, and I think they probably will do that because they're honestly, Games Workshop's kits used to be a bit shitty. No. Honestly, Games Workshop kits, they weren't the greatest of sculpts in the past. But they are getting really good, and they're not just because they're switching to true scale. I just think they look a lot more detailed. The plastic kits, I mean, they do seem to be getting a lot denser as well. You know, the number of parts on a sprue, the density of parts on a sprue is a lot more than it used to be in the past for the old plastics. Yeah. So I'm rambling again. I've been drinking loads since just to do this video because I'm a bit rubbish that way. So that's kind of it really. So that's my comment on this new update on the old world. And let me say this, actually, there's one last thing. If this new old world is going to be as magnificent as I'm beginning to think it will be, I might actually go balls deep on it, you know, and maybe this channel will feature a lot of content on the new world, or the new old world, when it's all released and whatnot. And so there'll be, you know, I don't know, painting and kit reviews, I don't know, just comment and stuff. I'd like to do that anyway. Well, we'll see. I mean, obviously I'm a lazy bastard and I drink too much and my hair's too long and things like that. But anyway, I might go serious on the old world, new old world when it comes out, and it'll be a feature of this channel if I keep up with stuff. And so if you might want to subscribe to this channel. That's what I'm trying to get to, you know, and then when if you're interested in the old world, oh God, this is getting too hard. I really should have a script, shouldn't I? No, I shouldn't have a script. No. So subscribe, and when the new world comes out, or the new old world comes out, I'll probably do some more videos, and you'll be notified. And there's a little bell thing. Tickle the bell. Tickle the bell and subscribe, and we'll have some fun later when it all comes out, the new stuff. And that'll do. Bye.